They looked at his desire to be taken seriously as a surgeon and his odd collection of uteruses, and they believed that Tumblety could have been Jack the Ripper.
Forget the royal conspiracies and the secret societies, because science just ended the mystery of Jack the Ripper. A Victorian shawl recovered from a crime scene in 1888 was recently tested for DNA. The results provided a shocking 100% match to a suspect the police knew about all along.
DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
After over a century of silence, history finally has a face for the man who stalked Whitechapel. The identity of this monster is hands down the biggest cold case reveal ever. So here's the deal on how they caught a ghost after 137 years. The Silk Mystery. Every great mystery has a single moment where everything shifts. For the Ripper case, that moment came not in a laboratory or a courtroom, but at an auction house in 2007. A man named Russell Edwards, an author and amateur detective who had spent years obsessed with the Whitechapel crimes, placed a bid on something most experts had written off as worthless. It was a stained, tattered silk shawl. This was not just any piece of fabric. According to its history, this shawl was recovered from the scene of the Ripper's fourth main victim, a woman named Catherine Eddowes. This happened on the night of September 30th, 1888. For over a century, the story was that a police officer at the scene, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson, took it home as a dark souvenir for his wife. It had been passed down through his family ever since, stored away and forgotten. Serious researchers dismissed it as just another piece of fake memorabilia in a market flooded with junk. But Edwards saw something different. He saw potential. He saw the one thing that Victorian investigators could never have imagined. He saw DNA. You have to understand what Edwards was up against. This shawl was over 120 years old when he got it. It had been handled by many people and exposed to dust and time. The idea that any usable genetic material could survive on it seemed almost impossible. But Edwards was hunting for the truth. He took his gamble to one of the most respected genetic researchers in the world, Dr. Jari Luhelin at Liverpool John Moores University. The doctor specializes in taking out genetic information from ancient samples. The team began their work in a clean laboratory, focusing on the visible stains on the fabric. What they were looking for was something called mitochondrial DNA. Most people know that DNA is a mix of stuff from both parents, but mitochondrial DNA is special. You only get it from your mother, and she got it from her mother, stretching back for thousands of years. This DNA does not mix or change much over time. This matters because it means if you find a living relative of someone's mother, their DNA should match even after 137 years. The first test was simple. Was this shawl even real? The team tracked down a living relative of Catherine Eddowes' sister. They took a sample and compared it to the bloodstains on the fabric. It was a match. The shawl was genuine and was present at the crime scene. But the scientists found something else mixed in with the blood. They found biological traces consistent with the person who committed the crime. This was the genetic signature of the predator himself. The team had a prime suspect in mind, a name that had appeared in original police files for over a century. They tracked down a living female relative of this suspect's sister and ran the comparison. The results came back as a 100% match. After 137 years of mystery, science pointed to one man. His name was Aaron Kosminski. Everything seemed to click into place the moment that name appeared on the screen. Aaron Kosminski revealed. Aaron Kosminski was a 23-year-old Polish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in the heart of Whitechapel. He was not a royal or a famous doctor like the movies suggest. The truth is much more unsettling because of how ordinary he was. He was not a genius or a phantom. He was a deeply troubled young man who lived and worked in the exact area where the crimes happened. The police at the time actually knew exactly who he was. Kosminski had fled Poland to escape terrible violence against his community. He arrived in London with his family in the early 1880s. Records show he was mentally unwell and likely dealt with what we now call paranoid schizophrenia. He heard voices and had violent outbursts. According to the police who watched him, he had a dangerous hatred toward women. This is not just a theory. This is what the actual investigators wrote in their notebooks. While the newspapers were busy scaring people with stories about secret letters, senior officers were quietly building a list of suspects. Aaron Kosminski's name was at the very top. Chief Constable Melville McNaughton wrote a report in 1894 that named Kosminski as a primary suspect. He described him as having strong homicidal tendencies. Even more proof comes from the man who oversaw the whole investigation, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson. Years after he retired, Swanson wrote a private note in the margins of a book. He wrote that the monster was Kosminski. He noted that Kosminski had been sent to a hospital for the mentally ill and died there. This means the man in charge of the hunt privately confirmed the identity of the monster. The confirmation was hidden for decades in a book that nobody saw until long after everyone was gone. The evidence is very strong. Kosminski lived right next to all the crime locations. He was known to be unstable and matched the descriptions given by witnesses. There is also the timing. In 1891, Kosminski's family had him sent away to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. He stayed in hospitals for the rest of his life and died in 1919. The Jack the Ripper crime stopped in 1891 at the exact moment Kosminski was taken off the streets. Every single thread, from the DNA to the police files, leads to the same person. Basically, the shadow in the fog was a local hairdresser that the police were watching the whole time. But to understand why he was so successful, you have to see the world he lived in. Living in the East End. Whitechapel in 1888 was one of the most crowded and poor places in the world. Over 900,000 people were packed into a few square miles of narrow streets and dark alleys. The air was filled with a thick yellow smog called pea soup fog. It was so thick you could not see your own feet while walking. For a predator, this was the perfect place to hide. There was no help for the poor back then. If you did not have money for a bed, you slept on the ground. The center of this misery was the lodging house. You could rent a bed for 4 pennies. If you were even poorer, you could pay 2 pennies to lean against a rope and sleep standing up. This is what survival looked like for the victims. The 5 women history remembers were not glamorous. They were women who had fallen through the cracks of society. They were between the ages of 25 and 47. They were just trying to get through one more night. This desperation made them very vulnerable. They had to trust strangers in dark corners because the alternative was worse. The Ripper did not need to be a mastermind. He just needed to know the local shortcuts and find people who were too tired to run. He knew every alleyway and every escape route because he lived there. The darkness in Whitechapel was absolute. Street lamps were rare and barely worked. When the violence happened, it was quick and silent. The city was a maze of crumbling buildings and filth. People lived in tiny rooms with 10 other strangers. Disease was everywhere. In this environment, a man with a sharp tool could blend in perfectly. Hands down, it was the most dangerous place on earth at that time. The police were trying their best, but they were fighting a ghost in a city that wanted to stay dark. They conducted thousands of interviews and detained 80 men, but they were limited by the tools of their time. There was no such thing as a crime scene team. When a body was found, hundreds of people would run to see it. Reporters would walk all over the evidence. The police did not have fingerprints yet because that technology did not exist. They had no way to test blood or track small clues. All they had were witness stories, and everyone saw something different. Some said he was tall, others said he was short. In that thick fog, agreement was impossible. The investigators were dealing with a puzzle that had no pieces, and the clock was ticking. Vanishing clues. The police actually found clues, but they did not know how to handle them. Near one crime scene, officers found a piece of an apron. On the wall above it, someone had written a message in chalk about how certain groups would not be blamed for nothing. Was this a message from Kosminski to confuse people? We will never know. The police commissioner was so afraid of a riot that he ordered the message to be washed away immediately. They destroyed a major piece of evidence before it could even be photographed. This was a huge mistake that still haunts the case today. Then there were the letters. Thousands of letters were sent to the police, but most were fakes written by reporters to sell more papers. One letter even had a piece of a human kidney in a box. It was sent to a local leader named George Lusk. Doctors confirmed the kidney had a disease that the victim also had. It was a real piece of the puzzle, but the police had no way to prove where it came from. The From Hell letter was the most terrifying because it felt real. It did not have the fancy writing of the other fakes. It was raw and mean. But back then, they could not track handwriting or paper types very well. The Ripper case became the first big media circus. It turned a sad series of crimes into a ghost story. This made the police's job even harder. They were chasing shadows and fakes while the real monster was likely sitting in a local shop. The pressure from the public was huge. People were scared to leave their homes. The Queen herself was sending telegrams asking for updates. But without science, the police were just guessing. They eventually realized that Kosminski was the most likely man. They put him in a lineup and a witness reportedly pointed at him. But the witness would not say it in court. Back then, if a witness stayed silent, the case was over. They could not force the issue. They watched him constantly, waiting for him to slip up. But before they could catch him in the act, his mind broke completely. His family stepped in and did what the police could not. They removed him from society. The moment he was locked away, the terror in Whitechapel finally ended. Science has finally caught up to the man who thought he got away. Science settles the score. When the DNA results were published in 2019, they were checked by many other scientists. The process was very long and careful. They proved the shawl was real and that the DNA on it belonged to Aaron Kosminski. Some people still argue about it because the shawl is so old. They worry that other people might have touched it over the years. This is a fair point, but when you combine the DNA with the old police notes in the timeline, it is hard to ignore. We finally have a name for the shadow in the fog. It was not a prince or a secret agent. It was a man who needed help and was left to wander the dark streets. The mystery of Jack the Ripper lasted over a century because it was such a scary story. People like the wild theories more than the simple truth. But science does not care about stories. It only cares about facts. The fact is that Aaron Kosminski was in the right place at the right time and had the right profile. He fits every single piece of the puzzle. Now that we know his name, we can stop wondering about the what-ifs and look at the real history. This discovery shows how far we have come in solving crimes. If we can solve a case from 1888, imagine what else we can find. The Black Book on Jack the Ripper is finally closing. It reminds us that no matter how long it takes, the truth usually finds a way to come out. What most people do not realize is that the From Hell kidney was actually one of the only times the monster might have reached out. It is chilling to think about a monster mailing parts of his victims. But today that kidney would have been tested and the case would have ended in a week. We live in a different world now. The ghosts of Whitechapel can finally rest. The man who caused so much fear is no longer a legend. He is just a name in a file, caught by a tiny trace of DNA on an old piece of silk. Does this final DNA evidence prove the identity of the Ripper once and for all, or is there still a key detail missing from the files? Let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history.